Hey everyone, this is SHR Modding and welcome back to another tutorial video. In this tutorial we're going to cover the last aspect of attention to detail and noticing little details within specific car sounds, and this aspect comes in very handy when you cannot find any source material or very little source material for the car that you are trying to create a sound for. In my case, I experienced this when I was trying to mod for the Mercedes CLK GTR, the V12 variant, the 1997 version, and I came across a hurdle when I couldn't find any footage of the external race car save a very short clip, which is about 40 seconds, the one you can see on the screen now. Combined with the fact that I could only find one onboard recording of the car, then this made it very hard to produce all of the samples needed for a sound mod. And so now this is where your attention to detail and your knowledge regarding car sounds and the nature of car sounds comes in handy, because you now need to find a substitute car that sounds exactly the same or near enough the same as the car you're trying to mod for. So what I'm going to do in this tutorial is I'm going to break down the main things that I notice about the CLK GTR's sound and the bits that I can use to create samples, and then I'm going to have a look at substitute cars, and I'm going to show you which kind of samples or which kind of rev ranges I needed to create samples from those cars, and then we'll have a look at the finished product. So this is going to be a bit shorter than the other tutorial. This is going to be a quick walkthrough. In the next tutorial, the plan is to cover audio software and Fmod. I might split that into two tutorials, because we're going to go through audio software, what kind of effects you'll need. We're going to go through installation, we're going to go through Fmod, explain the SDK, we're going to explain the events and parameters and that kind of thing. So that might be split into two sections, just because I want it to be as detailed and as easy to understand as possible. So for this tutorial then, what we're going to do is we're going to analyze the sound of the CLK GTR briefly, and then we're going to have a look at what other substitutes we can find if necessary. And in this case it is necessary, but always, if is always the case, because if you can find just enough footage or just enough recording to create all of your samples from, that's all you really need. So let's go ahead and have a listen to the CLK GTR. Turn that on for you. Okay, so the initial impression is Porsche 962, Porsche 911, classic 911 racing version. That's the initial impression for what this car sounds similar to. And I know it has a V12 and those cars have flat sixes, but remember what we said about the multiple of 3 engines sounding very similar to each other. In certain rev ranges they sound exactly the same as well. So we're hearing a nice conventional sound from this car at the moment. Hear that very deep note that the engine's producing. So in the low rev range, because the car isn't revving very high at the moment, even from the front and from the rear, the car is in it has a deep note, similar to what we saw with the McLaren MP44 and what we see with the 3-cylinder motorbikes. and other V6s and flat 6s which also have a deep engine note, a deep main engine note. So instantly from the front now you hear this completely different sound when the car revs up. I can hear the low note as well, the bass note of the engine, which is a low deep note, and then I can also hear an octave above that, and then on top of that I can hear a very strong induction sound where you can hear the reciprocations in the engine occurring, and that's a very unique sound. You hear that a lot in the STW touring cars, the super touring cars. You hear that a lot. You hear it a lot in the classic Ford Cosworth engines, and the RS2000, the Cortina, those kind of engines. And you hear it here as well in this V12. Do note though that it starts off with the low deep note on its own, and then it transitions into this sound of multiple layers. Let's just listen to that again. See the low note? Now it transitions. So now when he lets off the throttle, you hear that low note coming back through, less reciprocation and more of the low note coming back through. And then at the rear of the car, even when he's on throttle, it's all low note. There's none of that screaming or high note, higher octave, no reciprocation. You do hear a bit of a grunt, a bit of a secondary note coming in there, and that's what I mean when I say the V12s generally have a bit more oomph, a bit more rawness, a bit more roughness than V6s and smaller engines, because of that low note, that secondary note that isn't in harmonic with, that isn't in tandem with the normal engine note. It's in a harmonic, and it complements that. It doesn't copy it exactly. So this sound is very complex. That's the first thing we know. It sounds different in the low rev range, and it sounds different depending on whether the car is coming towards us or whether the car is going away from us. And we get a mixture of low and high notes. We get a mixture of harmonics. We get a mixture of the reciprocation, induction noise, and so this is a very complex sound. It's not a normal typical V12 sound. It's not a Lambo, it's not a Ferrari, it's something very unique, and this is why it's very hard to mod this sound. Not because it's a complex sound in terms of its characteristic, but because this is the only footage available from the race car where there's nobody talking, or there's no voiceover or commentary. So if this is the only video, then what can we get from this video to make the mod car sound as close to the original as possible without bringing in substitutes? So we can get this sample, this low sample here. Number one, we have the point where the driver gets on the throttle. We have that vibration in the whole drivetrain, and then we have a nice slow increase in RPM, and you always want slow increases in RPM when making samples. Ideally, obviously you can't have it all the time, but it's ideal in that way because you can make your samples much longer than usual, and that decreases the amount of times they loop, and so you also get something which is near constant RPM, which is an ideal scenario. And so you have to make less corrections in pitch when you're making the samples, and therefore you'll have less distortion in the final sample. So that's a good sample that we can get from this video. Now that bit where the driver gets on the throttle and accelerates into the rev range where all of these different sounds combine into each other, that is a very hard sample to make because the RPM increases so much from the start to the end in such a very short period of time. When you try and pitch correct that, you end up with lots of distortion depending on how you pitch correct. If you try and flatten the pitch in any way, you'll end up with a lot of distortion. and you'll end up with a very short sample, and therefore you'll end up with a sample that loops many times. For example, if a driver in the game is driving out of the pits, then that sample will be being used, and you're on pit lane speed limiter, and you're listening to this sample looping over and over and over again. That's what you don't want, because you don't want that loop to occur over again. That's a good sample we can make, even though it's a sample that is very short, and the rev range that it covers is medium. It's not too high, and it's not low like we'd want it to be, but it's medium. It's achievable. So what I mean is, from the upshift until the point where he lets off the throttle. So he just let off the throttle there. So did you hear from the upshift to the point where he left off the throttle? That's the sample that we can make, and the only real way you'll find out if you can make it or not is to try and make it. If it ends up being too distorted, or if it ends up being too repetitive, then you will have to discard that sample. And I've made this one, so I know it works. Just about it works, just because there isn't any car that sounds like that I can think of from any angle. And so when you're trying to recreate that sound, you always have to make samples that you won't actually end up using, and that's why it takes so long. And then we'll move on to the rear of the car where he goes past us, and we hear the sound coming out of the exhaust. Can we use that? It's, again, you'll have to try to make a sample from that. If it works, it works. I couldn't get a sample out of that section because, again, we're trying to make a sample which is flat in pitch, and in this footage he goes over a few bumps in that corner, and so that jolts the engine RPM up and down. And even when you flatten the pitch of the whole section, that section of audio, those bumps still rock the RPM pitch up and down, and there's such short rocks and such short changes in pitch, and it's very hard, by the normal conventional methods, it's very hard to flatten those out. So that's the first footage that we have of that's the only footage that we have of the race car. However, there was a road-going version of the CLK GTR with the V12. Now I'm not sure if it's exactly the same engine or if it's a modified version. And again, I'm not sure about the transmission, whether it's I'm pretty sure the transmission is a modified version. I presume the race versions wouldn't be fit to handle road car usage, primarily because they're unreliable and they are clunky at low speeds. So I'd imagine the transmission would be different. In fact, I think the road car would be is a manual, but I'm not 100% sure. So there is footage from the road car version. Some of it, most of it, really isn't usable, but there are videos like this where there's a GoPro mounted on the car and it's recording the exhaust sound. Now it's good for us that it's the exhaust sound and it's not mounted on the front, because that's the sound that we need. We've already got the sound from the front from the original video. One problem with this method of recording the sound, i.e. using a video or an audio source that uses a mic mounted to the car, is that you don't get any environmental sounds. You don't get any tire sounds in terms of the rolling noise that the tires make. You don't get any wind noise in terms of when cars are going at high speed. The wind, the air is displaced and it makes a noise as it's displaced. It's hard to explain, but you don't get any of that kind of noise. So if you record from a source like this, you have to add those in separately. And if you record from a trackside source, everything's already there. So when you record the engine sample, those get sampled in with it as well. And that's something that you should try not to remove, because it adds to the immersion of the sound. They add an immersive factor into the sound. You actually feel like you're at the side of a track and that the car is actually going past, because those secondary sounds of the air rushing past, the tires making the rolling noise, the wind, you know, those actually are sounds that you really hear at a real track. Now, I've seen games where the external sounds, I don't know where they've been recorded or what's been used to record them, but the sounds sound like they were either recorded in a garage and not edited. So you get lots of echo, lots of reverb, sounds like that the car's in a tunnel all the time, that kind of thing. Or that the environmental sounds are filtered out, or the reverb zones on the tracks are so powerful that it just sounds like the car's in a tunnel. And you know, you can see those examples online of different games that do that. You know, I'm not going to go into that here, but the idea behind sounds is to make them sound the most realistic as possible. And the way you do that is by making the environmental sounds part of the sound mod. Environmental meaning, you know, tire road noise, again wind noise, that kind of thing. And you make that as part of the sound mod as you can to make it sound immersive. Part of the reason why my sounds, you know, are immersive is because I don't edit the samples at all, hardly. I don't filter anything out. I try my best not to edit the equalizer too much. You know, if it's really bad sound, that meaning it's not got that much dynamic range, then I'll add some bass, I'll add some treble, or I'll remove some, that kind of thing. Those things are minor changes. I'm not filtering any of the sounds because I use free software, and free software is not good at filtering sounds. Free software is not good at filtering noise. If you do filter noise by using free software, it's going to decrease the quality of the sound 9 out of 10 times, and the actual engine sound, and that's not on. Yeah, so that's the disadvantage of using footage like this, which has been recorded on the car, in a sense. So we've got some nice, a nice low rev sample there, and also a gear shift sample. Okay, so it's a nice recording and it's a clean recording, but the mic is clipping. And so basically what that means is the car is too loud for the mic. The mic has a certain gain that it can record up to, a certain level, and this car is louder than that level, and so the mic is clipping, and that just creates distortion. All you can hear is distortion. And I tried putting this audio into the sound mod for this car, and it didn't sound organic, it didn't sound natural at all. However, the deceleration sounds don't clip as much. So you see how that deep note is there from the 962 and the 911 RSR, the classic one. And you also see that this is a prime example of what you want when you're recording a sample, is the RPM to really slowly come down, so that you can record good, nice, long samples. And the last thing is that you can hear that even in the high RPM off throttle, the car is still, the mic is still clipping, but not nearly as much as it was on throttle, and that audio is still usable. if necessary. So we're still looking for an on throttle exhaust recording of the car, because the first one is too peaky and pitchy to record and flatten. The second one is clipping a lot, and there isn't really a third one because there isn't any more footage of this car that is recorded like this, or any trackside footage. So what we're going to have to do is revert to a substitute, and by my knowledge of cars and by my hearing and understanding of engines, I decided to use the Porsche 996 RSR from 2005, and I decided to use this specific clip to record the sample. Now that car is currently at a higher pitch than what we've heard, but when you correct for the pitch, when you correct for the softness, because this is a bit more of a sharper sound, a slightly sharper sound than what we heard here from the rear. So this sound is quite muffled actually, and I don't know if that's down to the microphone or if that's actually how the car sounds, but this is the only real reference footage we have to go off. And the second reference footage is not from this car, it's from the road car, and the road car most likely has a different exhaust, probably even a different engine, modified engine. So we can't really say what the actual car sounds like in terms of if it's muffled or if it's sharp, but from what we can see it's muffled, and so that's what we're going to try to recreate. So this is a good clip. Number one, it's almost constant revs, or constant pitch rather, not constant revs. The car's obviously increasing in revs, but because the car's also going away from us, the increase in pitch that would normally occur due to revs is balanced out by the Doppler effect. So we basically end up with a constant pitch, and then it starts increasing ever so slightly towards the end of the straight. So this is a nice long sample that we can create and flatten. It's also not very sharp, and it's also when you turn it down to the pitch of the V12, it sounds very similar to the original clip that we saw, this one. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that I tried to mix and match the on-throttle sounds from the 996 and the off-throttle sounds from the road-going version of the GTR, and they didn't really match up. It didn't flow. Sometimes the sound doesn't flow. Even when you take samples from the same car, sometimes the sound just doesn't flow with itself, and so you need to re-record samples, put them in again, try it again, that kind of thing. And so what I did was, in this case, I just recorded some off-throttle samples of this same car, of the 996, and I put those in instead, and they were very comparable to the off-throttle samples of the GTR, but the sound flowed a lot better. It's just all about having a look at what you require and which cars match up exactly or near exact, and that's done by knowing what you're looking for. And knowing what you're looking for is perfected by your attention to detail. So that's basically all for today. In the next tutorial, again, we'll go over software. We're going to go over an audio editor. We're going to go over some of the basic effects to use. We're going to go over Fmod, probably the Assetto Corsa SDK, because it's a good place to start. We're probably going to start introducing sort of Fmod elements and that kind of thing. I might split that up into 2 videos. We'll see about that in the future. And then after that, we're going to start creating samples, learn about how to arrange samples in Fmod and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's where it's going to go. And that's all for today. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.